Hello folks, so Halizus entered into its 3-day paid early access phase just a few days ago, and with it came a landslide of review and ensuing guide videos all across YouTube. Launch is now officially less than 24 hours away, and with that I wanted to take a look into how the game has been received so far, what we can anticipate for its projected popularity, sales figures, etc, and overall just seeing how the land lays now that a portion of players have had the chance to dive in. To start us off, we'll take a look at the Steam charts, and straight away we can see that less than only 3,000 players are currently playing through paid early access. We've got no idea as to what these numbers could possibly be like for console, but given what I've learned from the past year, it is quite possible that the total number of pre-orders for the deluxe edition could be as low as 10,000 copies, with the likes of Wu Chang selling the majority of its copies via Steam and roughly only 1/4 of its sales coming through PlayStation 5, with Xbox being responsible for even less sales for Wu Chang due to the game coming to Game Pass as of day one. So using this as a very rough comparison, it could very well be less than 10,000 copies of the deluxe edition pre-ordered, but given my lack of experience or knowledge with pre-order numbers, I've genuinely no idea if this is a good or bad sign for the game. If I were to hazard a guess, I'd say this does look quite bad. 10,000 copies is not a lot for a game of this caliber. Halizus isn't a AAA game by any means, but it certainly wouldn't have been cheap to make, and just from looking at these numbers, I can't help but just feel a little bit worried for its overall success and future. Of course, within less than 24 hours, launch will have arrived, and I'll be keenly watching the Steam charts to see how things get on. It's also very likely I'll be rolling out another video similar to this one, basically to circle back to this topic and see how things progress. It's no surprise to me that Halizus is struggling, however, as there are currently multiple factors not going in this game's favour. For a start, we have the likes of Lost Soul Aside and Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater releasing not very long ago. Now, neither game has hardly dominated the market, however, they will have taken some focus away from Hal Is Us. More importantly, however, we have Hollow Knight Silksong sharing the same launch day as Hal Is Us. You know, that really obscure and not highly anticipated sequel that we've all literally waited years for. Regardless of the lack of similarities in gameplay, many players will simply not want to purchase or get too carried away with another title when so close to the release of a game as big as Silksong, especially when the standard and deluxe edition prices of Halizus can be quite pricey, depending on your region and platform. Now, to a certain degree, Halizus has also been misrepresented as a Souls-like ever since it was first announced. This has been corrected and rectified over the years, but I wouldn't be surprised if a decent portion of players are still under the impression that Halizus is more Souls-like than anything else, and of course that may have played a part in some players just not being interested from the get-go, such as players who will be more inclined to appreciate the story, puzzle, and investigation mechanics, etc. Then, one of the biggest factors that's likely to play a part here would be the game's focus on no hand-holding and forcing the player to figure out everything for themselves. This, of course, appeals to some of us, but definitely not all. I've no idea what the percentage for that split could be, but what I do know is Halizus has gameplay that is not for everyone, and as a result, games that are more accommodating will just generally be more popular. Essentially meaning I suspect some players will be put off by this game due to the inherent challenge that comes with it. Combining all of these factors, and likely a few others I haven't even thought of, I can to an extent see how and why Halizus may struggle. I've been doing this for nearly a year, and I have watched a range of different games launch, whilst paying somewhat close attention to their numbers, and Halizus is one of the lowest that I have seen all year. Again, these numbers will change as of launch tomorrow, so tomorrow's video will be a lot more accurate, and I also don't have all that much experience with paid early access numbers, but of course, the more games we cover, the broader my own experience does become. And I always have these videos and numbers as a reference point for in the future. With all of that said, however, Halizus currently sits at a 92% positive review score on Steam, with just over 200 reviews so far. A smaller drop in the ocean of gaming, however, it's still a very good ratio, and overall it helps showcase exactly what I mean about this game being overall very well made and fleshed out. Heading over to Metacritic, we can see plenty of ratings ranging from 70 to 90, with 82% of reviews being positive and the other 18% sitting within mixed. Once again, highlighting the simple fact that this is very much not a bad game and has practically zero aspects that spoil the experience. I personally have rated Halizus as a 9 out of 10. I considered 8 or 8.5, but ultimately it was only the combat and some aspects of the main story that I felt left any room for improvement. And I feel most players who think they may be interested in this title will likely not regret their decision to dive in. Now, as for my own experience with Halazus, the game is very much up my street, and I have had a great time with it so far. I received an early access key roughly a week and a half ago, and I've racked up over 70 hours between actually playing through, aiming for 100%, and then spending a lot of time collecting footage for guides. I may have had a very fun time. However, I am also very conscious of exactly what kind of gamer I am. I literally will play anything and give almost anything a go. I come from a much simpler time. I have a high tolerance and patience for most games, and I personally really like games that present challenges such as this one. So I know that despite how much I've enjoyed this game, I am likely looking through some of its flaws more than I should. That said, however, I still firmly believe this is overall a very good and fun game. It has no aspects that spoil or mar the experience, and say what you will about the combat, it's still at the very least serviceable, but most importantly fun if you're willing to spend a little bit of time with it. I say this because so far all reviews and critiques have focused on the combat being lackluster and basic, as well as enemy variety being quite low, so both factors combined make for a repetitive and tedious experience. However, I personally did not feel this, despite my wealth of experience and knowledge with Souls-like and action RPG games. Halazus has anywhere between a healthy 20 to 50 hours of solid gameplay, with less than half of that being the actual combat, and even less if you do take on every puzzle, good deed, mystery, etc. In contrast, we have 4 weapon types, 25 glyph abilities, 8 or so drone abilities, over 20 relics and passive relics granting unique combat buffs, 2 defensive gear items granting even further buffs, and then light and heavy attacks, dodging, blocking, parrying, and a self-healing mechanic. So there's certainly a fair bit going on there. I say this because I feel as if the combat in Halazus is being framed as bad or worse when I've played a plethora of games that have a higher focus on other gameplay mechanics outside of combat, and usually combat has actually always suffered as a result. I feel this is not the case here. I do not disagree that the combat leaves a little bit to be desired. However, I feel the effort that has been put in should be appreciated, considering there is a bit of variety available, but again, it is also quite fun. To compare this to the likes of, say, Kazan, which really isn't a fair comparison to make, but we're doing it anyway, Kazan is almost entirely focused around its combat and has very little going on outside of this, other than some rudimentary side tasks to complete by defeating enemies, so combat related anyway, as well as exploring through levels and collecting equipment, collectibles, etc. Other than a very small handful of other features, Kazan and many other Souls-like and action RPG titles strictly focus around combat, and it does of course make a lot of sense as to why. I make this comparison because I feel like gamers as a whole have become far more familiar and comfortable with tougher and tougher combat challenges, so experiences such as the combat within Halazus may be judged harsher than it actually should be. In the Kazan comparison, Halazus offers far more than just combat gameplay, with all of its narrative, investigation, puzzles, and exploration. Again, I'm simply just making this comparison to show why we as gamers may have slowly grown to expect more, want more, or even just anticipate more. It's completely fine to feel that way. This is a complicated topic to pick apart. What I'm essentially saying is, if we judge Halazus against other action-adventure games, then it does hold up very, very well. However, if we judge it against games outside of its genre that it has definitely taken some inspiration from, such as solid Souls-like games like Kazan or Wu Chang, things do become to compare a little bit differently. And I feel like this may be what a lot of us inherently do as gamers, so I'm simply just trying to highlight the distinction between the two and explain as to why Halazus is being critiqued the way it is. None of this is to say that any criticism is unwarranted. This isn't a perfect 10 out of 10 game, and it does have areas that could be improved, but overall it is a very solid experience that does hold up well in all of those areas, some more than others, but nothing falls into negative space, and overall the experience is very rewarding and fun. Anyway, I'll be back tomorrow with more news on this subject, and I have a range of guides for Halazus releasing over the coming days. I also have a range of guides and news videos on the channel already, so do feel free to stop on by and check things out. Otherwise, thanks for watching folks, and until next time, peace.